Good morning. Good morning, everybody. All right, I'm on a little bit of an audio delay, so if I start talking really slow to try and line my voice up with that guy, that's why. I'll try not to listen to that guy at all. So we're going to be talking about migrating your ASP.NET project to ASP.NET Core incrementally with a tool called YARP. Quick show of hands, anybody already played around with YARP or using YARP? No? Okay, in this room anyway, we've only got maybe one hand, so it sounds like there's going to be some new information here. Is that music supposed to be playing? Okay. My name is Jonathan Tower, J for short, and I'm going to be taking you on this journey. So we have a client that came to us a few years ago and said they wanted to upgrade their ASP.NET project to ASP.NET Core. And they had struggled with this because this was 3 years ago, and ASP.NET Core was a bit newer back then. It was about halfway through its history at the point. And YARP didn't exist. Some of the other tools we're going to look at today didn't exist. And so they really struggled with this upgrade. We actually helped them do it anyway. But if they came to us today with the same problem, all the tools that we're going to look at today are the things that we would have actually recommended that they use. So this is like a real world thing that we really use with our clients that we've kind of wished we could use for years. One thing I just kind of get out of the way is some terminology here. So probably, I'm guessing if you're in a ASP.NET Core talk, that you're probably familiar with some of this technology, terminology already. But just in case you aren't, let's all make sure we're on the same page here. So .NET Framework, this is the flavor of .NET that we've all been using for years on Windows. Came out in around 2001, which maybe predates some of your careers. I actually started using it in about 2001. And the last version, and I don't mean the most recent version, but I mean like the last version of .NET Framework is 4.8. That's the last major version. They're not going to be coming out with any new major versions after that. Support, yes, it's going to be supported for years. It's a Microsoft product. But about 7 years ago, .NET Core came out. And then about 3 years ago, that got rebranded to just be .NET. So you might have watched Build a few years ago when Scott Hunter talked about how there's now one .NET. The idea of that is there used to be .NET Framework, .NET Core, Mono, a bunch of other less popular versions of .NET. But all of those kind of got merged together with some of the work that's been going on with Xamarin turning into .NET MAUI, and then also all this work with things like .NET Standard that create a standard for all these .NETs. And now we're just referring to that as .NET. So we're going to be talking a lot about these terms in this talk today because I'm going to be talking about upgrading an app that was built on .NET Framework to .NET. And sometimes I find that a bit confusing. I don't know if anyone else agrees with me about that. Sometimes saying like .NET versus .NET Framework, it's kind of like, wait, what is he comparing? So I might refer to it as .NET or .NET Core. That's like the new, modern, cross-platform .NET. If I say .NET Framework or just Framework, I'm talking about the old legacy Windows-only version of .NET. So hopefully that makes sense. Before we jump into it, this is a little about me. Slides are going to be available at this GitHub link if you want to take a picture of this slide. There's also a QR code on here. I'll be available for questions afterwards if you want to ask me anything about this topic, about .NET, about consulting, about anything. Sometimes there's questions that maybe require a little bit more depth or maybe are a little embarrassing to ask in public when there's a line of people behind you. Even though you probably don't need to be embarrassed, we all are facing the same types of problems. And you can always just say that someone else developed this app, it wasn't your fault. But if you have that kind of question, if you don't have time to get into it and you want to talk to me afterwards, there's two great ways to get a hold of me. One of them is this QR code with the bit.ly link under it. And another one is at the back of each of these rooms, just as you're about to leave the door, there's a teeny little shelf over where the trash cans are, and there's a light, and I've put some of these brochures about Trailhead. There's a same QR code in there. If you want to get a free consultation with me, you can use this QR code, and we can talk in depth. We can look at some code together. We can figure out what your problems are and try and get you some good advice. So I'll show that again at the end with the GitHub link as well if you're interested. This is what we're going to talk about this morning. I want to talk a little bit about just different migration approaches, and one specifically called the Strangle Fig approach. I want to talk about what a reverse proxy even is. This talk has this acronym YARP in it, which stands for Yet Another Reverse Proxy. So I want to talk about what is a reverse proxy even. I want to talk about how YARP works specifically. Then there's a tool that doesn't exactly come with YARP, but is very strongly related to YARP that's called the .NET Upgrade Assistant. I want to look at that and how it's going to help you use YARP to create an incremental migration from your ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core app. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the system web adapters, which is a NuGet package that ties in some of that old system web namespace that's available in ASP.NET and is not available in ASP.NET Core. So those are the things we're going to talk about. Starting out with some different approaches to migration. If you've been doing this very long, like I have, you've probably tried all of these approaches before. These are the three most common approaches when you're doing a migration. Let's talk about them each in turn. The Big Bang approach. You know this one when you get locked into the big conference room with the whole team and you're not allowed to come out until the entire app is migrated. You know, everyone can relate to this. The only contact with the outside world is pizzas that are slid under the door. This is the Big Bang approach. This has some pretty obvious problems with it if it's a very big application at all. If it's a smaller application, maybe this is a good fit, but then also maybe you don't need to incrementally migrate, and so maybe those parts of my talk today aren't so applicable to your project. If you can do it while you're locked in a conference room for a day, probably not something that has to be done incrementally. Also, Big Bang approach, if it's a larger application, obviously this is not a very agile approach. This is definitely a waterfall approach, and so all of the problems that come with that approach are going to come with this approach. Probably is not going to be very successful. You can't release this app incrementally all throughout that process. You're probably not updating the app throughout your migration process. You're probably just waiting until the very end and actually upgrading it then. Evolutionary approach, I think of this as the make it better, make it worse, make it better, make it worse kind of a cycle. So if you picture like a sine wave, that's kind of what this process feels like when you're doing it. This has some overlap with the Big Bang approach. The way you can think about this is that we have our app and it's in one technology or it's architected or designed some way, and we want it to be in some other technology or we want it to be designed some other different way using a different architecture. And to get from A to B, what we're basically going to do is we're going to refactor a little part of it, which is probably going to make the app worse in some way. And then we're going to refactor that to make it function better. And then we're going to move stuff over to the new technology. It's going to get a bit worse. Then we're going to refactor it and try and make it a bit better. Keep doing that. Now, you can technically release this application throughout this process, but obviously you're going to have like poor performing parts of your application. There's a really high probability of regressions in this scenario. So maybe this isn't the best approach if you're doing a very large application. The last one is the one that we're going to really be focused on today, which is called the Strangle Fig approach. Anybody heard of this approach before for other architectures? Yeah, okay. So I see about 20% of us have heard of this before. So maybe this is familiar but for some of us, but for the rest of us, the Strangle Fig is this vine that grows. I believe it's in like New Zealand or Australia, somewhere in that part of the world. It actually starts growing from a seed that gets dropped, usually by birds, way up in the branches of a tree, which is a weird place for a vine to start growing. Usually you think of them growing out of the ground, right? But in this case, it starts up in the tree, and it shoots vines down the tree. Eventually, those vines get into the ground. They start to wrap around the tree's roots and basically choke out the tree's ability to get water and other nutrients from the ground. At that point, the tree dies. Sorry, tree. It's kind of sad if you love trees. But the strangler fig now gets all those resources, and it kind of uses this dead tree as like a backbone that lifts it up into the sky to get up to that, sweet, sweet sunlight. So if you think about it, this strangler fig has basically started out as sort of a parasite, and it's taken over and slowly replaced the tree that was there before. Now, if you saw one of these, you might say, wow, that tree has a lot of vines on it, but it grows its own leaves up in the canopy. You might not even notice at first that it's not the tree anymore. And that's kind of the idea of the strangler fig approach, is it's a gradual replacement where you, the, let's say, user or observer, doesn't notice the difference as it's happening. Okay, so what's that look like in an architecture diagram? This is kind of what that would look like. So if you take a legacy application that has the majority of your code in it, and you have a modern application that maybe starts out mostly empty, but that's the technology or architecture that you want to use, you put a facade layer in front of it. This could be all kinds of different technologies, like a reverse proxy that we're going to look at today. It could be some cloud-based technologies. But you're basically going to put some sort of a facade layer in front of it that ties these together. Second step is you're going to gradually move functionality over as you have time. Maybe it's going to take you years, maybe it's going to take you months, but you're going to gradually move that functionality over from the legacy application to the modern application. All the time, that facade is going to be there tying things together so the users are none the wiser. Just like with the strangler fig vine, you don't really realize that the tree is dying. You're just the user, and your functionality is all just working in the app. Eventually, in theory, you finish. All of your functionality from the legacy app has been moved to the modern app. At this point, the facade doesn't really do any good, so you could remove that unless you're using it for other things, like maybe you're using it for microservices architecture or something like that. Then you could keep it, but you don't need it anymore technically because you've migrated everything over. Okay, so that's the strangler fig approach, which is really what YARP is going to help us do with our ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core migration. So what is YARP? So this slide I was supposed to update. YARP stands for Yet Another Reverse Proxy, kind of a fun name that Microsoft created for this. It actually came from a bunch of internal teams going to the ASP.NET team and saying, do we have any .NET-based reverse proxies? We have this project, we're doing a big service on Azure or a big service for Microsoft customers, and we need to migrate things from one technology to another, and we want to have a reverse proxy. And there's some other ones that exist out there, as indicated by the name Yet Another, right? But we want to use one that we can integrate into our .NET and C# code, and maybe like configure on the fly based on data in a database or something like that. So they asked the .NET team. The .NET team said, no, but that would be kind of fun to make. So they started making it. Once they started making it, the word kind of spread inside of Microsoft, and there was all these different purposes that they needed reverse proxies for. And so some of those teams that were doing upgrades started using it right away. But some of the other teams that were like, oh, we have a reverse proxy that's in .NET. Great, we could use it for load balancing, or we could use it for this other thing. So there's all these teams now that are using it, and Microsoft said, light bulb, maybe this is a product. So that's where YARP comes from. You might be asking, okay, you keep mentioning this term, reverse proxy, Jay. I'm not a network engineer. What the heck is that? Maybe you're familiar with the term proxy, so let's start with that. These are sometimes called a forward proxy to differentiate it from a reverse proxy. Or if you just call it a proxy, that's usually what people are talking about. So my example of this was I went to college long enough ago that there wasn't internet in my dorm, but one of the guys in my dorm had a 14.4 modem. Anybody have a 14.4 modem, right? So fast, you can't use all that bandwidth, right? 14.4 kilobits per second. That's so much. So one of the guys had a 14.4 modem and a dial-up internet connection, and everybody else wanted to use that to, well, let's be honest, game. So a LAN was run through heating ducts and things like that through this old dorm building. And that person with the 14.4 modem set up a proxy server on their desktop. Basically left it on all the time. They weren't paying the electricity bill, right? It's a dorm. So they had a proxy server running on that, and it was basically connected to the internet 24/7, and people that were on that little surreptitious network could use the internet whenever they wanted. So that is what this diagram is showing, all these clients on a network connected to a proxy server to share an internet connection, basically. Okay, so that's for outgoing traffic. If you basically reverse the direction of this diagram, swap the internet and the proxy server like this is what a reverse proxy does. So now you've got the internet and the reverse proxy in the opposite order. So now clients are connecting over the internet. They have their own internet connections, and they're off to hit some IP address that's given to them through DNS. That IP address points to a public IP on this proxy server, this reverse proxy, which then looks at that request and knows how to forward it into the correct server behind it that's theoretically maybe not even exposed to the internet on a public IP. So a reverse proxy is more for incoming traffic. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between a proxy that you may be familiar with and what a reverse proxy does. If you think about load balancers or in some ways firewalls that are handling web traffic, this is kind of a reverse proxy. All right, so now we know how a reverse proxy works. Let's talk about how YARP itself works. So YARP is installed in your ASP.NET Core application, and it's installed as a NuGet package. So here you see a diagram that's similar to the last one we were looking at. We've got clients connecting in. We've got an ASP.NET application. It's got some MVC endpoints, and it's also got YARP installed in it. Now, keep in mind that MVC is what I'm calling it here. But in ASP.NET Core, Microsoft really merged Web API and MVC together. And so this could be API endpoints. It could be MVC like view endpoints. But it could be anything, right? It could be minimal APIs if you're into that recently. It doesn't have to be MVC there. So ASP.NET Core application has YARP installed, and it's got some sort of endpoints that are ASP.NET Core based. So this traffic comes in from a client. As you may or may not know, ASP.NET Core has this thing called a pipeline that handles your requests and responses. During your configuration, it used to be in a program CS class. Now it's in like a program CS file that just has loose code in it that's not really wrapped in a class, if you've seen that more recently. And you'll see some things configured in that class. It'll configure dependency injection of different services, and it'll configure your pipeline. So the order of the pipeline really matters. You want YARP to be pretty high up in your pipeline because it should look at the traffic first before it gets down to MVC or whatever else is going to route it internally in this application. Now, here's the great news. If you don't totally understand what I'm talking about, you don't have to worry about that if you use this tool we're going to look at in a minute called the .NET Upgrade Assistant. But basically, that's going to put YARP in for you. You can put it in yourself, high in the pipeline. YARP's going to get that traffic first. It's going to look at ASP.NET has something called a routing table. And all of the different ASP.NET, ASP.NET Core technologies that use routing, which is like MVC, Web API, minimal APIs, they're all going to use that routing table. It's going to look at that routing table and say, do I, in this ASP.NET Core app, have a route for that traffic that's coming in? If the answer is yes, then it's going to go ahead and forward it to the MVC or whatever else is further down the pipeline that actually configured that route. If it's MVC or Web API, it's going to hit some controller and off your code goes inside of your ASP.NET Core app. Now what happens if that traffic comes in and it's not in that routing table? It's going to come in, it's going to hit YARP. YARP is going to say, I don't think I have a route for that in this app. So it's going to go ahead and forward it through, or proxy it through, to your legacy ASP.NET app. So that's basically how YARP works to proxy your traffic. So if you look at the Strangler Fig approach as an architectural diagram that we looked at before, and we look at what's that actually look like in our ASP and ASP.NET Core projects, this is kind of what it looks like. The major difference between that nice clean 3 boxes is that we really only have 2 boxes. The facade layer is played by YARP, which is in your ASP.NET Core application. The modern application is also in your ASP.NET Core application. It's just a different technology, MVC or something like that. And then the only other box is your legacy application, your ASP.NET application. Okay, so now you're kind of up to speed on the Strangler Fig, what a reverse proxy is, and how to use YARP to do an incremental migration. So let's actually look at something called the .NET Upgrade Assistant. Before I show you a demo of this, I want to actually tell you a little bit about it and what it's capable of doing. So if you're trying to do an upgrade from a .NET Framework project to a .NET 6 or newer project, it can do that. If you're trying to go from one of the .NET Core versions to a .NET 6 or newer, it can do that. If you're trying to upgrade any version of like modern .NET to any other version of modern .NET, it can do that. It also has stuff for some special different types of projects. What types of projects does it support right now? ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core. There's, I think, 4 or 5 different versions of Azure functions. You can upgrade all of those from one to a newer version. If you've got a WinForms or WPF application and you're looking for a little help getting that to run on .NET, you can do that as well. Class libraries, obviously, that's something that you're going to have to upgrade to reuse your code in your new application. It can help you with that. Console applications. A really tricky one is getting from Xamarin Forms to .NET MAUI. It doesn't do it all for you, but it does help quite a bit. So that's a useful one. And then if you're the one person in the room who has a UWP app that you want to upgrade, it can help you with that as well. Also, I think this is kind of exciting for any of us that used WCF. Anybody use Windows Communication Foundation? All right, and you're willing to admit it. That's awesome. So you probably are well aware of this if you're using it, but there is no WCF in .NET Core. So if you want to upgrade your app without basically rewriting your whole API layer, there's no great way to do it except that there is an open source project that basically ported that with not technically support from Microsoft, but some Microsoft team members helping with it to make sure that it was successful. So that was successful enough that the .NET Upgrade Assistant team has decided to support it as one of their migration paths. It's not in there yet, but it is coming. So if you're still stuck on WCF and you're like, what is all this REST stuff that people are talking about? This can maybe help you move in that direction. All right, so now let's actually look at the demo that we're going to be doing the rest of this time. This is using the .NET Upgrade Assistant to upgrade an ASP.NET application using YARP. Okay, so I'm going to open up my project here. And first of all, I want to just show you that the Upgrade Assistant is an extension. So if I come in here to my extensions, you'll see that I've installed it here. And if you don't have this installed, you'll just need to add it here, which you can do by looking online and searching for .NET Upgrade Assistant right here. And you can install it in your Visual Studio. And once you do that, you're going to have all this great tooling that we're going to be looking at the rest of this demo. So the first thing we want to do is let's just look through our project here to see what we've got. So we've got 2 projects in here, purposely a somewhat simple application just so that it works really well for a demo. We don't have hours to sit here together and do this, right? So an MVC app that you might remember the eShop demo from years ago if you've been doing ASP.NET for a while. This is this is a stripped down version of that eShop demo running on ASP.NET MVC. And then I've got a eShop legacy utilities class. So if we actually go to the properties for these, you'll see these are running on .NET Framework. So this is .NET Framework 4.7.2. And this class library is on 4.6.1. So the first thing I could do is probably bring those onto the same version of .NET Framework, but that doesn't really matter in this case because I'm going to start migrating this anyway. All right, so the first place I want to do is I want to start with my class library because that's actually going to be referenced by my existing code, but it's also going to be referenced by my new ASP.NET Core project that we're going to create in just a minute. So to have that be available for both ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core, does anybody know what I want to do to my class library to make it compatible for both? .NET Standard, yes, I heard it. Perfect, so that's what we're going to start with, is upgrading this library to .NET Standard. So the first thing we'll do here is right-click on it, and you'll notice there's an option that you may have not seen before if you don't have this extension installed. It's the upgrade option. So right there, I'll click on the upgrade option. You can see I've got a whole bunch of different choices, and if you read through them, you can kind of get a feel for which one is the right fit for you. But I'm actually going to do the in-place project upgrade because, you know, I like risk. Okay? So now there's a bunch of different versions of .NET that are available. .NET 6 through .NET 8 are installed on this computer. So you can see it's offering me all of those things, including .NET 8's preview version that's available right now. .NET 8, when it's released, will be a long-term support version of .NET. .NET 7 is the current version of .NET that's out, but it's a short-term support. So right now, if I was doing this, it probably makes the most sense to me to upgrade to .NET 6 because it's long-term support, and it's already been released, which .NET 8 hasn't been yet. So I'm going to pick .NET 6, and I'll say Next. It's basically going to show me what it's going to do here. I'll say go ahead and upgrade those. And now it's going to go through the progress, and you're going to see little green checks appear next to things as it does it. And I got a bunch of warnings here, but we'll fix those in just a minute. So now it's finished, and if I now right-click on the properties for this class project here, you can see it's now .NET 6. That's okay, except I don't actually want it to be .NET 6. I want it to be .NET Standard. So I'm going to go back into this project file. And now that it's upgraded, I can edit the project file right here. And I can say Net Standard 2.0. Okay. So now if I close that, I close this. And if we go back into the project properties, we should see .NET Standard 2.0 here. Okay, so now this is a class library that could be used either in a .NET Framework project or in a .NET project or a .NET Core project as well. All right, but there's a problem with that. If I try and build it, we'll see those errors again. So the main one here is that it doesn't know what HTTP context is. The way we're going to solve this is with something that we're going to look at towards the end here, which is called the system.webadapters. This is basically a wrapper that takes all of the, well, not all, but many of the calls you might have been using that were part of the system.web namespace in your legacy application, and it shims those with calls to the modern versions of the equivalent things in .NET Core or .NET. So we'll go in here, and we'll go to Manage NuGet Packages. And I'm going to just search for system web adapters. And you can see this one right here. and I'll install that. All right, now let's go ahead and come in here. And if I look, you can see I now have system.web. And if I look at where that's actually defined, if I go to the definition of that, you can see that that's actually coming from that NuGet package. It's not coming from system.web.dll, because system.web.dll doesn't exist in .NET Core and later. But this this Microsoft ASP.NET Core.System Web Adapters NuGet package is essentially creating that same API for me and then wrapping the modern stuff. So I don't have to go update my code. I can still use this HTTP context.request.headers instead of the new syntax that I would actually use in ASP.NET Core. And this is going to work whether this is running against .NET Framework with actual system.web available, and it's going to work if this class is running in .NET Core later and there is no system web available. So that's the kind of cool part about that. Okay, so now let's actually try rebuilding this and make sure my class library works. Okay, so you can see down here the build was successful. So we successfully built our class library. Great, so now we have unlocked that. Let's go ahead and upgrade our ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core. I know going into this is going to be a lot more work. If you've ever tried to do this manually, you know that as well. This is going to take a lot longer, so this is that incrementally part that we were talking about. This is not going to work well to do everybody locked into a room in one day. This is probably going to take months, depending on how big our application is. But I'm going to click on this project, and I'll pick that same upgrade option that the extension provided us. But you can see I get a different set of options this time. The side-by-side incremental project upgrade is the only option that I'm provided here. And if I actually read the details there, you can see that it provides kind of a detailed description of what it's going to actually do. And you can actually see that acronym that we're focused on today, YARP, mentioned in there. So it's going to set up YARP. It's going to set up a new ASP.NET project for us. It's going to basically tie those two projects together. So I'm going to pick that option. You might already have an ASP.NET Core application that you want to use. We do not. So we're going to go ahead and say we want to do a new project. And here we get a chance to name it. It just puts Core on the end. I'm going to take the legacy and replace it with Core. Okay, same choice as far as which frameworks to use. I'm going to actually pick .NET 6 again. And it's going to provide me with kind of a plan. And I'll go say finish. And now it's actually going to go and run through all that stuff. You can see some of those green checks appearing. With each of these steps, if you're interested in reading more of what it's doing in each of these, you can look under there. But okay, so I just went through all 6 of those steps and it finished successfully. If I look at my Solution Explorer, I can see I've now got 3 projects in here. One of them is called eShop Core MVC. I've got my original eShop Legacy MVC. And I've got my class library that we upgraded to a .NET Standard. If we look at this Core MVC one, you'll see that this is set to run on .NET 6 when it loads here. There we go. So we've got a .NET 6 project. This one is now a .NET Standard 2.0, so it can run either way. And this one is still .NET Framework. Let's look a little bit more at the setup here. So if we look at the Core MVC project, you can see there's not a whole heck of a lot in there right now. If I look at the dependencies, you can see that it's added the system.web adapters that we just talked about and added a minute ago to our .NET Standard library. It's also got YARP in here, which in the NuGet library is called YARP.Reverse Proxy. And it's got the program CS, which is basically where we set up our dependency injection and our pipeline. The important part in here that it added for us is 2 things. Number one, you can see it's using system.web adapters here. And the other one is you can see it's using something called map forwarder. And it's actually got kind of a hard-coded set of configuration in here for a route. There's a lot of different ways to do this configuration. You can do it in code. You can do it from a configuration file that you load. This one is kind of like a super simple setup that's using what's called a catch-all route. So when I explained before and I showed you how YARP worked and I said it looks at the routing table in this application, this catch-all route is basically going to say, look in the routing table and anything that doesn't exist in here, that's the catch-all, go ahead and route it to this other website. And this other website is coming from our configuration, which you'll actually see set up in our launch settings. So you can see my environment variables being set here in the launch settings. And regardless of which of these profiles I'm using, it's setting a proxy2 setting. And you can see it's going to this port here, 52429. And if we actually look at our legacy application under properties, under the web tab, we can see 52429 is the port that that application is going to be running on. Okay, so that's our legacy application. Both of them will be running on localhost, so they have to be 2 different ports, right? And then if we actually look at where our modern ASP.NET Core application is going to start, it's going to be on this 7281 port here is where we've configured it to start. And importantly, if I look at my solution settings, under the startup projects, you'll see that both the legacy and the core app are set to start up. Okay, so when I'm doing debugging here in my local Visual Studio environment, it's going to start both of those when I click the play button above. And it's going to start them on 2 different ports. The core app is going to basically be configured to forward anything it doesn't have internally, any routes it doesn't have internally. It's going to forward to the legacy application. So let's actually try building and see if we can test it out right now. So we're trying the build here. And you can see the build succeeded, so we know it's safe to go ahead and run this. So I'll go ahead and start it now. Now keep in mind it's only going to open one browser, but there's going to be 2 applications running. Okay, so if you can see that, it's the 7281, which is my modern application. But if I copy this, I can actually open up my legacy application, the 52429, up here on the second tab. So they're both loading right now because we've got 2 ASP.NET projects doing on-demand compilation. And of course, when you're presenting, it always takes longer, right? Okay, so here we can see on the core app, my application loaded. I've got some data in here. I can click on the Create New button and see that screen as well. And if I go over to the other tab, you almost don't even see me switch tabs because it's the exact same application. This is now running on a different port, .NET Framework application. So great, you've basically completed step 1 of your migration. We could theoretically now launch both of these applications out to production, and I've done absolutely no changes to the actual code, right? I've basically just installed some NuGet packages, set up a couple different projects, and made kind of a more complicated network diagram with my reverse proxy. But I've now got an ASP.NET Core application that's forwarding all traffic through to my ASP.NET .NET Framework application. So this is step 1. I could launch this to production now, and then over the next months, we could do updates every couple weeks or something like that with stuff that's been migrated from the .NET application to the ASP.NET Core application. But let's go ahead and look at an example of that. Before we do that, I want to show you a legacy endpoint that we're going to migrate. We're going to practice migrating here. So under my controllers, API controllers, let's see, there it is. Under my regular controllers here, I have a system web controller. I wanted to show you actually using a class library, and I wanted to show you using system.web namespace, so that you can see some of the major complications with this upgrade and see how relatively easy these tools make it to do the upgrade. So this is a very simple view here. It's setting a property of the view bag called user agent equal to, and then I'm calling this getHeader method from some class, which if we look at where some class is defined, it is in my class library. And you can see the class library is doing a context.request.headers for the user agent header. Okay, so that is a system.web namespace right there, running against .NET Core with the ASP.NET Web adapters. So it'll run on either .NET Framework or .NET Core. And in my legacy application in the endpoint here, I'm basically getting that user agent back as a string from this method right here, and I'm setting that to the view bag. And then if we look at the view for this, under system web index, you can see it's a very simple view. It's going to use my default layout, and it's going to just put that view bag user agent right here on the screen. So let's go ahead and run that and actually try that in the legacy application and see what that looks like. And then we'll migrate that functionality into the ASP.NET Core application. So now I got to boot up my application again. And I'll open up the legacy one behind here as well. Okay, so I don't have a link to this, but if I just type in system web, that's going to go to that endpoint if I spell it right. So that's going to go to my system web endpoint. Now I'm doing this on my .NET Core app right now. It's forwarding it through with YARP using the proxy. And the .NET Framework app is what actually responds. So behind the scenes, it's basically taking that and going to system web back here and hitting this page. So as you can see, these two pages are 100% identical. And we get that same result. I get my user agent actually displayed in there for my browser. OK, so now I want to move that functionality into my new app. So let's go ahead and quit that. All right, so now I'm going to right-click on my legacy app again and pick Upgrade. So you might have thought that this screen was done, right? We already set up YARP and have the new project with the proxy between the two of them. This screen still is something that you can come back to all throughout the migration process. You actually see on the screen there, it's showing you like a pie chart that's showing you how migrated your app is. And we are at 0% right now. So congratulations, everyone. 0 is a percent. So we are somewhat done with the migration. Tell the boss. But now we actually want to start upgrading this code. So I'm going to come over here and say I want to upgrade a controller. I'm going to pick that system web controller, which we find right here in the list, and pick upgrade. And I'll click upgrade selection. It's going to go through and do all the dependencies and things that it needs to do, which includes that view that we looked at, and the layout and a bunch of other things that are dependencies of that endpoint, or of that whole controller, I should say. And now, if I go back to the summary tab, you can see that we are now 6 2/3% complete. So actually, update the boss. We're well underway. We're almost done, really, right? But just like a lot of projects where we tell the boss that we're almost done, this is actually not going to build yet. So let's try it. OK, so we ran into a problem. If I go here to the new controller that got added, you can see this is in the ASP.NET Core application. It says, first of all, it did something kind of funny here. Keep in mind, this tool isn't perfect with everything. That code before it was just viewbag.userAgent, and now it's this weird thing, converting it to string and then trying to set it to something. That's not going to work, right? So I want to basically put this back to how it was before. So it was just .userAgent. Okay, so the upgrade assistant kind of biffed on that. The next problem is it doesn't know what some class is. The reason it doesn't know that is because I haven't actually told it it should reference my utilities class yet. So I'll come in here and I'll go to dependencies and say I want to add a project reference, and I'll add my utilities, say OK. All right, and now right away that code problem goes away and my error goes away. So let's go ahead and try the build again. Okay, so we're still getting another problem. Now this is a problem that is a bit of a bigger problem. Whoa. Okay, we okay? This HTML string functionality doesn't exist in this same format in ASP.NET Core. So I could try and fix this right now, or I could do the best kind of fixing, which is commenting it out, right? So we're going to comment that out for now, and we can count that as being done, right? Now we'll put a to-do comment in there, and we'll come back and fix that later. But that's a bigger change, and if you look at what's actually happening there, it's just writing the machine name out into the footer. Maybe I don't even care about that functionality, so we're going to worry about that later. Let's look at our error list. Nothing else in the error list, so maybe we'll get lucky. We'll try the build one more time here. And you can see the build succeeded this time. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens now. While it's launching, I'll just show you under Solution Explorer that my core MVC app now not only has that controller in it that we just fixed, but look at all these views that it added there too. All of the views that were referenced by the views that were used by my controller got moved over for me. Okay, so we'll go in here, and you can see we're on the core application port right now, so I'm going to go to System Web. Okay, so it kind of works, right? So I still see all the content that's supposed to be there. I see the images, I see the text, headers, paragraphs, all that stuff. Styling is totally missing. If there's any like interactive JavaScript on this screen, that's also going to be broken. If I actually open up the dev tools and show you everything here, and then if I filter it by JavaScript, you can see there's one that's actually for hot reload. That's kind of injected into the page by the by the Visual Studio debugger. But other than that, there's no JavaScript, and there's also no CSS on this screen. If I go back to my other screen, there is CSS and JavaScript on this page. So something's wrong. Let's go ahead and see what's wrong. Okay, this might be wrong, and this might be wrong, right? These are my next problems. Now, these aren't huge problems. These are basically because ASP.NET Core does not have the bundling tool, the web optimizer tool that you might be familiar with for doing bundling at compile time. And Microsoft basically said when they created ASP.NET Core, you know what, there's a ton of these things, including Webpack and a bunch of other tools like Gulp and Grunt that are out there that are meant for doing this exact type of thing for bundling JavaScript. We're not going to reinvent the engine or reinvent the wheel here. We're going to let these tools that are, the best of breed tools be out there and do their thing, and we're going to do our thing. So you could rewrite your whole application to have all the bundling and minification happen with Webpack if it's a more modern application, or Gulp or Grunt if it's an older application. Or you could bring in a NuGet package that's going to do it all for you the way, a third-party NuGet package that's going to do it the way that the bundle config works in the legacy applications. So let's see, do we have time to do that? I think we have time to do that. I have the code all pre-wired up here so that it's going to save me some time. This also makes your migration process a lot easier. If you've already done it before, you actually do it. That helps. Okay, so there's this third-party tool that we're going to bring into our core app. So I'll come in here to manage NuGet packages, and I'm going to search for LigerShark. And there's this tool called LigerShark.weboptimizer.core. And this is the third-party tool that basically replaces bundling. So if you want to do bundling essentially the exact same way you did it before in an ASP.NET MVC application, this tool is going to do that for you. If you want to modernize your application, you could probably eventually replace this with something more modern like Webpack. But we're trying to basically migrate this as quickly as possible, and we just want it running in .NET Core. We want all the advantages of .NET Core, cross-platform, higher performance, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and install this LigerShark Web Optimizer in my application. Okay, So with that installed in there, I'm now going to come into my code, and I'm actually going to copy some code just to save some time so we can get through this demo. I'm going to start by copying this code here. I'll go to the layout. Right here where we've got this code commented out, I'm just going to paste in like regular HTML for a CSS link and a script tag. Now you notice the URLs that I'm using are essentially the exact same URLs I was using before. Okay. Now I'm going to come down here and I'm going to use the modern syntax for script tags, which I can do like this. And right here, I'm going to use the exact same thing. Exact same URLs I was using before, bundles jQuery and bundles bootstrap. Now I haven't actually set up that LigerShark tool at all yet, but I want to show you, maybe surprisingly, that this should actually work. I always hate to say it's going to work before I actually run the demo. This should actually work if we run it like this. And I'll be interested to see if it does, if anyone can guess why it's actually working. So think about that while we're booting this up here. I'll go ahead and type in system web. Okay, so I'm on 7281, so that means on my ASP.NET Core application. I did install that LigerShark component, but I haven't set it up at all yet. Can anybody guess why these endpoints are working now? Anybody in this room? The reverse proxy, that's right. Because those URLs don't exist in the routing table in ASP.NET Core, YARP is looking at those and saying, I don't know what to do with those, so it just forwards them off to the ASP.NET application running on .NET Framework. And that one says, oh, I know what to do with these. I still have those set up as bundles. So it goes ahead and responds with the JavaScript or the CSS for each of those. So right now, we're basically forwarding these requests through to the old bundles. But if I want to actually set this up so that I can edit these bundles in my ASP.NET Core application, I can use this LigerShark tool to do that. So let's go ahead and finish that. Okay, so the next step is we're going to, we already installed it, so we're going to basically go in here and copy over the content and scripts from our legacy application. So if we go to the legacy app and we go to content here and scripts here, whoops, keep hitting control instead of shift, or shift instead of control. So okay, I'm going to copy both of these folders. The content has my CSS, the scripts has my JavaScript. I'll go into here and just paste those in. Now right away we see that it makes a whole big mess out of my project file. It's going through and it's like excluding everything and then it's including everything. I want to get rid of all that junk and just put in like a wildcard for all of that stuff. So I'm going to get rid of both of these sections, and I've pre-written this so I can just paste it in here. But this is a new item group that is going to basically include anything in my content folder and copy it to the output directory, and include anything in the script folder and copy it to the output directory when the build happens. After it's in the output directory, I don't necessarily need to deploy these because these are actually going to, I do need to deploy these because they're going to be used at runtime by the LigerShark tool to actually create my build, so that's why I want them copied to the output directory. All right. The next step is to actually add LigerShark Web Optimizer into my project. So I'll go into my program CS here, and I'm going to add right here above static files, I'm going to say app.use Web Optimizer. Okay, so that adds all the dependency injection stuff for LigerShark. And then right here at the top of the stack, I'm going to add some code. Now this code is going to look somewhat familiar because it's going to be very similar to the code you would use to build bundles. So I'll actually compare that to the bundling code for you a little bit. But right here is the actual configuration code. So I'm creating a jQuery bundle that uses this. I'm creating a jQuery val bundle that uses anything that matches this wildcard, and so on with all my bundles for JavaScript and for CSS. Now, if you actually compare that side by side with the bundle config of the legacy app, you'll see that it's almost exactly the same. The only difference is actually removing some tildes and slashes. But for the most part, it's basically the same. This is creating bundles in the old way using Microsoft's Web Optimizer. And this code is, sorry, not this code. This code is creating it the new way with this LagerShark third-party tool. All right, so now I should be able to actually run the code. So let's do that. And you might be thinking, how will we be able to tell if it's working? It was working before from the proxy server, and that's a really good point. So we might actually have to go make a change to our new code. Or another way we could do it is we could actually blow away the bundle config from our old code so that the bundles don't exist there, so that the proxy server won't work if it ends up forwarding this through. So let's go ahead and do that because this is working. Let's check my new endpoint. This one is working as well. So maybe we did it. Let's actually check by going into my legacy app here. And I'll just go into where the bundle config is called in the app startup. And I'm just going to comment that line out. So now I'm not going to have any bundles in my legacy app. So now if we go to that new system web endpoint, or really any endpoint, if the bundles are working, it's going to be because the bundles are coming from the new ASP.NET Core application. So moment of truth. Let's see if it loads with some CSS. Oh, a lot of suspense here, huh? And there we go. So now I've migrated all of my bundles over into my new project. I've migrated one of my endpoints over. I've migrated one of my class libraries over. Now I'm well on my way. Now maybe we actually can tell the boss that this project is almost done, even though it only says 6.67% on the upgrade assistant. So that's kind of the process you would go through to upgrade. I want to just mention a little bit more about the system web adapters. There's some other really cool functionality in these if you want to use them. One of them that we saw, which is basically creating wrappers for the SDK. The other ones that are super useful, that are too complicated to show in this short time frame we have together today, is bringing authentication together between your two applications so that they share authentication, and bringing session state together. So if you have a legacy app that's using a lot of session state, you want to update that session state and have it updated in both of your apps so that that session state value is the same no matter whether you're running an endpoint in Core or you're running an endpoint in .NET Framework. You want that data to be synced up, and there's all kinds of different ways you can configure that. You saw the system web adapters NuGet package that we added. But if you're going to add stuff that brings together authentication and session state, you're going to want to add the framework-specific version of that, or the .NET Core specific version of that, which is these core services and framework services NuGet packages. Lots of great stuff online if you want to Google it. There's some new YouTube videos, actually, that the YARP team put out that show you how to do some of this stuff if you're interested in it. Also, if you want to hit me up online, I'd be happy to help you through any of those processes as well. So YARP is in 2.0 right now. It's in production. System web adapters are in 1.1 right now. Both of those are getting updated really regularly, so you definitely want to keep an eye on that. The upgrade assistant that we looked at, it made that one mistake that we saw. It's not perfect yet, but it is getting updated all the time. It's in a preview release at the moment, so just keep that in mind if you're using it. It's not going to do everything. It's not going to do everything perfectly, but it is going to help you a lot, and it is, I would say it's solid enough to use at this point. If you want to learn more about it, here's some links you can check out that have some good information, good starting point for each of these technologies we looked at today. Obviously, if you want to connect with me, if you want to see the slides, this GitHub link is a good place to go. Just remind you about the free consultation. If there's anything that you're afraid to come down and ask me afterwards, or if you're in one of the remote rooms, these should be right by the door, just above where the trash cans are, by that light. If you want to grab one of these, you can contact me there. You can just take a screenshot of this and contact me as well. So I'll look forward to taking your questions online. I've got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions in the room as well. Anything in the room before I go online? Yeah, right here. How long would, oh yeah, how much time on the free consultation? We usually shoot for about a half hour. So if it takes longer than that, then obviously my time is my product. So we'll talk about like, here's kind of an approach that you could use. If we need to get into a lot more depth, then I'll have to start charging you, but we can talk about that, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, depending on what version of ASP.NET Core you're using, you can reference .NET. You can, but you have to run ASP.NET on .NET Framework. That is true. Any online question I can take before we close up here? Okay, I take it that there's a no. Okay. Thanks, everybody.